For the grandkids, our campaign is Let Us Vote. We used to say balanced budget amendment, but that's not a term that's actually going to work for where we are. So we got to thinking about what should this amendment do for future generations? And our view is that we should look to an amendment that maximizes the prosperity of our grandkids. So how would we do that? Here's where we stand today. Think of the economy as a pie. You've heard of the economic pie. And today, Congress takes about 26% of the pie. The rest goes to the states and the people. Under current law, under the Constitution of the United States, the current law that's in place put underneath the Constitution of the United States, Congress is planning on taking almost half of the economic pie in 40 years. So the people that grow the pie have a shrinking share of the growing pie that they were responsible for growing the economy. Does that sound fair? Does it sound fair that Congress should have the authority to take half the pie and then drop the rest of us by a third? So how can we fix that? Dr. Paulson presented a paper from the Congressional Budget Office. In 2008, we had a national discussion in Orlando, Florida about amending the Constitution. We just thought, no, we ought to take a look at this. And this is something that has driven me all the way since 2008. Because what the CBO said, Paul Ryan said, I want you to forecast for the next 75 years, two things. We're going to sustainabilize the entitlements, and they gave them the particulars, and they actually put it into law and got it out of the House of Representatives. And I want you to limit the growth of discretionary spending to inflation plus 0.7%, basically inflation and population. The CBO has scored this 3 times. And every time it's the same answer. GDP per capita goes from 40,000. Real GDP per capita goes from 40,000 to 160,000. I could see my granddaughter sitting out there. They're living the American dream. Every generation in American history has passed on the dream of peace and prosperity to their kids and their grandkids. I could see that in the roadmap. So, think about it. Whose income should grow faster? The people that grow the pie or the federal government? So we came up with, based on the Swiss experience, and I'll show you a little bit more of what happened in Switzerland, but this is Maximizing Americans' Prosperity Amendment. Pretty straightforward. Spending growth limit. Spending can go up every year. There's never a cut. But it requires that the Americans' net income grows faster than the spending growth of the federal government. If there's an emergency like a pandemic or a war, yes, you can go above the spending growth limit, but you have to pay it back with interest over time by reducing the future spending growth limit on an annual basis. Well, I know a lot of you talked about enforcement. Actually, Warren Buffett came up with this idea on CNBC about 11 years ago. And every time I throw this out, people's eyes get so big. We really think this is a way to enforce it. The enforcement is if no member of a majority party of Congress who violates the spending growth limit, and it's a number, it's audited, it's totally independent. They can't mess with this. This is how much you can spend total in a year. If you spend more than that, you have violated the Constitution, and you as a majority party are not running for the election next time. Section 4, what if what if a majority of the states want to change that spending growth limit? Or what if a majority vote in Congress wants to change the spending limit? They want to propose a program or whatever. It can be proposed by a majority vote of the states or Congress, and then it's ratified by the Article 5 state convention mode, which is a vote of the people for the yes pledged vote, yes pledged delegate in 3/4 of the states, which is a vote of the people. So that is our prescription for maximizing America's prosperity. And there are a couple of questions that always come up, and we already have. Would taxes have to be raised to balance the budget on an annual basis? No. It says nothing about balancing the budget on an annual basis. Would federal revenues increase without actually raising taxes or introducing a new tax? The answer is taxes as a percentage of GDP will go up because of inflation and going up through tax brackets and so forth. CBO always tells us this. So yes, over time, revenues would increase without a tax rate increase. Would spending cuts be required? Absolutely not. So we've given away the answer to this. So let's go to what happened in Switzerland. The first thing that happened is that they started paying down their debt to GDP ratio. And it went into effect in 2003. The red line's on the bottom. You can see it's sloping down from close to 50% down to 25%. But the real key here is what Fitch, who measures the debt quality and rates every sovereign country in the world, they said the debt break means Switzerland is the leader of the pack, the best investment. If you want to buy a bond, there's only one hitch. If you want to invest in the bonds, at their treasury bills of Switzerland, you're going to have to pay them 0.75% interest a year. And that is because they have the highest rated credit in the world. The spending, averaged increase in spending was 2.1% since 2003. And there were only just a couple of years that the spending actually went down. And what we heard is that because the 85% of the people voted for it, the politicians and especially the bureaucrats were scared to death. If I go over the top, I'm toast. And so they literally never hit their spending growth limit. Is that right, Barry? Yeah. So their spending goes down because they're afraid of going over the top. So here's the bottom line. And here's why I want you to vote for my granddaughters. I want you to vote for the MAP amendment because in 17 years, the Swiss went from lowered GDP per capita, slightly lower, to a higher GDP per capita. You see the line here. Switzerland is way ahead of, and for a family of four, the numbers in real terms add up to $32,000 more in real GDP for a family of four. And that's what I want for my granddaughters. So I hope you vote for, the MAP amendment. Thank you.
Okay, we got time for some questions on these different proposals. And while we're looking for any coming in and any from the floor, I guess the first question I would have to maybe throw out to all three of you is, could you take a minute each and describe perhaps the difference between the proposals and perhaps why is one better? How would you distinguish and what is the difference?
Well, first, revenues are going to have to go up. It's primarily a spending problem. Math doesn't come close to working. And anybody who tells you otherwise, anywhere, not very good at math. Okay, I'm a CPA among other things. So that's the first thing, all right? Second thing is balanced budget, we've already said won't work. 49 of 50 states have it. There are a number of states that would go bankrupt today if they could. They're not eligible for bankruptcy under current federal law because of how they calculate a balanced budget, all right? Thirdly, you have to think about political feasibility. In order to get something either the old-fashioned way, two-thirds of the House, two-thirds of the Senate, three-quarters of the states, or the way we're advocating, which is two-thirds of the states propose a convention and then three-quarters of states have to ratify, it's got to be politically feasible from a bipartisan standpoint. The last comment I would make is that, and I think the debt to GDP is the one that is by far the most politically feasible. It is accepted by economists. It is a measure that accomplishes what needs to be accomplished, but yet it gives Congress some power as to determine what the mix ought to be between mandatory spending reductions over time, discretionary spending priorities and reductions over time, and revenue over time with an enforcement mechanism. Because if you don't have that, you don't have much.
So Barry, would you speak to that? What's the difference and particularly this enforcement mechanism portion? If you go ahead and speak to that.
Well, let me follow point by point my good friend David Walker and refute everything he said.
Do you have your button on there, Barry?
Sorry.
Is your-
Okay, first of all, revenue. I don't think there's anything that requires that revenue or spending increases relative to GDP. And indeed, that's what in Switzerland, it's been relative, essentially what the Swiss debt break there requires is that the government grow no more rapidly than income. So why should government grow more rapidly either in terms of revenue or spending? I would disagree with that. He says that you state legislators have failed. That's not true. There are a few zombie states like Illinois who haven't balanced their budget and haven't constrained debt for half a century. They're zombies. They are bankrupt. They are. Well, I'm saying there are a few exceptions, that there are a few zombies out there. And of course, the federal government bails them out. But most state legislators are reasonably successful in balancing their budget year in and year out. There's some years where they fail, some years where they don't fail. So states have success. States are the success story here. And my state, Colorado, is a success story, not just in balancing the budget. We have the Tabor Amendment that, in fact, imposes the kind of constraints that I am proposing. It constrains the growth of government to inflation and population growth. It limits debt. It requires voter approval for any increase in taxes and debt. And by the way, I'll tell you the reason for the success of the Swiss debt break. Citizens vote on everything at every level of government. They rely on the referendum, the initiative, and they have put fiscal measures on the ballot in Switzerland hundreds and hundreds of times. Rely on your citizens. Have trust in your citizens. They are fiscally frugal. In Colorado, this goes back over the Republican and Democratic. We went from a red state to a blue state, but people have been proposing increases in taxes on the budget, on the ballot in Colorado for the last 3 decades. Hundreds of measures. At the state level, the only tax increases that have been passed are sin taxes. Citizens don't like tax increases, believe it or not. And if you rely on them, they won't raise taxes. They won't raise your tax burden. Flexibility. Well, I think that what the Swiss have decided, they have this very straightforward constitutional amendment that's very straightforward. Balance the budget over the business cycle so you can have, if you have deficits, you've got to balance that with surpluses. That's pretty straightforward and it's pretty flexible. And it, of course, provides for emergencies. So there's a lot of flexibility built into those fiscal rules. And I think that the fundamental issue for me is, will people understand this? If you go to the citizens of your state and say, we think that under Article 5, we should enact an amendment to the Constitution to constrain debt, to constrain the growth of government, and you explain that to them, you're going to have to explain this in simple, straightforward terms. Essentially, we got to balance the budget. We got to bring expenditures into line with revenue, and we have to limit the amount of debt. And this means constraining the growth of government spending. That's an easy sell. That's what we sold with Tabor. I helped design Tabor. I helped pass it. And we have a success story in the States, not failure. So if you look at our experience, this is the kind of amendment that will make it and will work.
So let's come to David then. David, your explanation of.
Can I just say real quick? Okay. Simple explanation, credit card limit. Every American knows what a credit card limit is, all right? And reduce debt burdens. They understand what that is, all right? I can tell you, I've served Republican presidents and Democratic presidents. I have contacts on both sides of the political aisle. I have a very good sense of what's politically feasible and what's not politically feasible. And we can all have great ideas. And I do think it's a good idea. All right. And I do support the concepts. And Tabor, I think, is great. I think it's great. Okay. I wish Congress was as responsible as most state legislatures. They're not. And I also agree that if you can get this to the people, you'll get a lot better result. You'll get a lot better result. I agree with that.
We agree more than we disagree, you
So-
can tell.
David Bidoff, how would you describe the differences in what you're proposing?
Well, my approach is very simplistic, and the job for you people that have become delegates to the convention for proposing a fiscal responsibility amendment will have to do the math. This is a math problem. And you know, Dave could be right. You may have to have some revenue increases. We won't know that until we actually start putting together the models. And Dr. Paulson and Meriwether, is he here? Are putting together, and there are other people that have models. We need to run the models to educate yourself on what needs to be done to ensure the long-term prosperity of this country. And so it could well be that we have to have a belt and suspenders, as Walker likes to talk about. So,
So I'd like to throw to each of you, how do any of your proposals deal with the QE, the printing? I mean, if you're setting limits, does the Federal Reserve just not find a way to work around that? And
Well,
now we're doing reverse repos and QEs and all of these different things. Are there not ways around those sorts of things in what you're proposing?
well, the truth is, federal fiscal policy is irresponsible and unsustainable. And the truth is that the current Fed monetary policy is unsustainable as well. And I did an op-ed, and in fact, it's enabling irresponsible fiscal policy by artificially keeping interest rates low, by buying a vast majority of the new debt. So we don't really have market rates right now, okay? And what I've proposed with regard to the Fed is to eliminate the requirement for them to focus on short-term unemployment. That they should focus on how do we grow the economy over time, which provides more opportunity? How do we maintain stable prices over time? But when you get them to have to focus on short-term unemployment, that politicizes them. And right now we're in a situation where the economy is growing. We have a record number of job openings, but we still have higher unemployment. And so that's giving them an excuse to do a lot of things that are short-term gain, increased risk of long-term pain. And that needs to change. We need to get them focused on what they originally set up for and depoliticize them, because they've been politicized right now. And I don't think they're as independent as they need to be.
So Barry, to that point, then, are we not just pushing on a balloon? If you're dealing with the fiscal policy and the budgetary policies, the monetary policy, not just another blowout you push on one side of the balloon, it comes out somewhere else. How do you deal with that in the context of this kind of amendment?
Well, I agree with David. And the answer the way I would put it is, there was a time in which we had monetary responsibility as well as fiscal responsibility. Go back to the 1990s, Paul Volcker achieved an incredible achievement.
Yeah.
He constrained the growth of money the money supply, and he brought inflation down from, remember inflation in 1980? Double-digit inflation, double-digit interest rates. By the end of the 1990s, Volcker had the inflation rate down below 5%, as I recall, and interest rates weren't much higher. We balanced the budget, by the way, for a few years in the late 1990s. It's called the Great Moderation in the economics literature. We had legislators, we had people in the Fed who pursued responsible monetary policies, responsible fiscal policies. Unfortunately, that Great Moderation is gone. We've given up on fiscal rules. We've given up on monetary rules. The Fed is essentially an arm of the Treasury. The Fed is pumping money into the system because that's what the Treasury wants. They want low interest rates on bonds so they can borrow more and spend more and borrow more and spend more. And unfortunately, we don't have a Paul Volcker out there, and we don't have a Phil Gramm out there anymore. And we cannot rely on the discretion of legislators. We can't rely on the discretion of the Fed. And I would take your argument one step further. Not only do we have to have fiscal rules, we have to have monetary rules. And there's a really good literature in economics on how you can constrain monetary policy by imposing rules on the money supply, rules on monetary policy. You should grow it. Milton Friedman had it right a half a century ago. You should grow the money supply somewhat more rapidly than the growth of income. And that will keep your inflation rate at the 4%, 5% level. Now that is what they achieved. We can get there, but not by discretion, not relying on the decision of legislators or the Fed officials. We need rules, rules-based fiscal policy, rules-based monetary policy, just like you have rules-based fiscal policy at the state level.
Thank you, David. Bidoff?
To answer that question, we may have two spending growth limits. And one of them would be if inflation, it gets over a certain percent, it would affect the growth, spending growth. In other words, if the Federal Reserve was pumping in money and we got into inflation, then spending would potentially actually start stopping and maybe even start cutting. In other words, the household income under inflation, they're losing spending power, they're losing standard of living. We don't think that the government should be able to get away with that, that we would penalize the government from growing if they tried to do it through monetary policy, so that it would be in essence a fiscal rule that was built into the MAP amendment. Secondly, that was essentially a MAP amendment that was put into the Constitution by a vote of the people in Colorado. And in the 20 years afterwards, this is where I always come back to prosperity. In the 20 years after, the income to what is it? The per capita GDP of Colorado increased almost 100% more over the next 20 years than for the country as a whole. The GDP per capita grew almost 100% faster than the GDP per capita for the country.
All right, I have one last question here. What will moving toward this type of fiscal restraint not simply push out fees in times when they limit the budgetary actions of a government, then they simply come back and add fees somewhere else? Is that not something you'd be concerned about? Let's go ahead and start with you this time then.
Under my proposal, if they added a fee, it's going to go to pay off the debt because they can't spend anywhere. They can't come up with another program and tax this group or that group because they cannot spend more money than the spending growth limit. So go ahead and pass the fee. It's going to pay off the debt.
Okay. Other thoughts?
Well, I think you're probably addressing our problem in Colorado, and that is that because Tabor was effective in constraining spending and certain types of spending and certain types of revenue, because it's both a revenue and a spending limit. Of course, our legislators found many ways to call taxes fees. They have an excise tax on hospitals. They call it a fee. And there's no question, they have been successful in circumventing this to some extent. But as David said, ultimately, the constraint on the spending side does limit what they can do. And we're trying to address the fee issue by amending the TABOR to apply to fees as well as taxes.
I don't see any other questions. Let's, if we can get the polling question ready. We've got, you've heard these three proposals and we just want to get your feedback and thoughts on from what you've heard. As far as what you've heard so far, would you be more likely as a delegate to favor the debt to GDP approach that David Walker mentioned, the BVA with the Expenditures Limitation Act that Dr. Paulson mentioned, or the maximizing the prosperity that David Bidoff mentioned? If you could go ahead and weigh in on those, and we'll get to this polling, and then we'll be about ready to wrap up. I know, got one, that's right. So for your enjoyment while you're doing your polling, I scanned through the fiscal cliff and kicking the can down the road, and it's amazing. Even the political cartoonists, they don't hold out any love for either party. This is certainly not a partisan issue, partisan blame by any sense of the imagination. This is something that's been coming for so long from both parties on all sides of the issue that we continue to simply see the can being kicked down the road. And there's one here that I like particularly, we're not going to kick the can down anymore. We'll just punt it from now on. As they're tabulating the polling results, we have one last presentation, and we have the opportunity to hear from Mr. Bob Carlson. Bob has a distinguished background. He is currently the leader of AMAC Action, the advocacy arm of the American Mature City. He'll tell you, AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens, and it's the advocacy arm of that. Mr. Carlson worked in the Reagan administration, among other opportunities in a variety of political realms, and we're honored now to hear from Mr. Bob